Hey, everybody. I am your host, Lyndsey Smith, for this episode of The Agronomists. I was just adjusting my volume because I just about made myself deaf there. So looking forward to today's episode. This is going to be, I think, a lot of fun. So really looking forward to bringing in my two guests here. But before I do that, just wanted to make sure that I mention you can, of course, earn CEU credits for watching this episode. So please head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomists to make sure that you claim those CEU credits. All right. So tonight's episode, all about soil health, but most importantly, soil resiliency and how do we manage our soils to ensure that they're resilient. So whether that's drought or flood and everything in between. So without further ado, I'm very lucky tonight. This is very exciting. I bring in Marla Riekman out of Manitoba. She's with Manitoba Agriculture and Resource Development. New name. Welcome here, Marla. And Anne Verhallen with OMAFRA, soil management specialist for horticulture crops. You and Jason DeVoe might be our only horticulture people that ever make it on the show. Mm-hmm. Yeah, probably. All right. Okay. Now, Anne, where are you based? Because this is your first time on the show.
I'm based out of Ridgetown. I'm based right at the college, so University of Guelph Ridgetown campus.
Okay. Very cool. And Marla, of course, you're in lovely Winnipeg, so we'll just, yeah.
Skip over that
I'm just kidding. We'll just skip over that. I'm from there. I'm allowed to say these things. I'm just kidding. Sort of. Okay, so tonight we are going to talk about soil. We're going to talk about soil health, soil resiliency. And one of the things that my colleague Lara, the first thing out of her mouth was, okay, but wait, how do we even define a resilient soil or a healthy soil? How do we even measure that? So let's open the evening with that. Now, Anne, it looks like you're still thinking. So, Marla, I'm going to go to you first.
I need to look more thoughtful.
Yeah, you need to work on your thinking phase.
It's one of those, don't make eye contact.
Right, exactly. Oh my God, she's going to call on me. Yeah, exactly.
Look at me. Oh my goodness. There, you know what? Man, why did you have to pick the hard questions first, Lyndsey?
Hey, I didn't. Blame Lara.
Okay, well, it is... But a resilient soil is going to be one that can withstand or rebound from all the different stuff that gets thrown at it. And it's hard. I mean, it's the same thing when we try to define soil health and exactly what makes a healthy soil. It all depends on what you're trying to, I guess, achieve from it too, right? There's so many different aspects of it. So resiliency in a soil, I think of it exactly as that, something that can rebound from whatever impact is being thrown at it.
Okay. Anne, how about you?
Yeah, well, I'd use an example of where I was this morning. I was out walking a cornfield with a grower down by Harrow. They've got hit by a lot of rain in the last little while. In fact, they got 2 inches over the weekend. We could walk through that cornfield, no problem. He's in a strip till situation. He's got a heavier soil type. He's built resilience into his soil. Mm-hmm. He's got enough earthworm middens and things like that he's got some really great internal drainage. He's built some really nice aggregate stability, and yeah, he's got a resilient soil. That corn's still looking great.
Okay. So, and you've hit on a couple of things, obviously, right off the hop. Marla mentioning, of course, a soil that can withstand or still, of course, be healthy and perform even in trying conditions potentially. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, Anne, as you mentioned, a soil that can actually move water through it and can still maintain its structure. I mean, these are the components of, as we try to define what is a healthy soil, if we can sort of put a stamp on it. I don't think we're ever going to get to that point. Wouldn't it be nice, though, to have a little plus or minus? Like, yes, check mark. Healthy, moving on. I don't know. I don't think we're going to get there. But so tonight, though, we are going to talk about all of those things, of course, because the West right now, a huge portion of it and a huge portion of the U.S. as well, mired in drought. And I mean, just heartbreaking photos coming in of essentially no crop there, livestock, of course, getting sold. There's just no pasture either. And then, of course, we move to the east and here in Ontario, and we are actually wet. And not just, hey, it's rained too much. We're having these huge rainfall events, like you mentioned, Anne, where we've just got a deluge of water that falls all at once, and it's got to go somewhere. So those are the things we're sort of going to unpack tonight. And one of the things I do want to start relatively early on with clips, because I have this habit of not getting to the clips. Lara calls it the journey to the next clip. We just start talking and we never get there. So I wanted to square this all up and sort of kick off the evening with a soil school episode, just a snippet of it. It's 4 or 5 minutes with Jody DeJong Hughes out of the University of Minnesota. If anyone heads over to her YouTube channel, it's one of those videos. It has well over 60,000 views, and it was like one of those immediate. There just seems to be such a hunger for this sort of conversation. So we're only going to play a snippet. So if you want to go and see the rest of it, it's about 12, 13 minutes. Go and listen. But we're just going to listen to this clip of it and talk about sort of what makes a resilient soil. Jay, if we can go to that clip.
When people ask you about, organic matter and does it really matter, you always start that conversation with resilience.
Yes. We have a lot of different words out there, and sustainable and organic and stuff, but I really like the word resilient, because what organic matter does is help our soil to rebound from drought or excessive rain. It can recover quicker and help our crops grow better.
Now, a discussion of organic matter, you just can't start. You've got to sort of set up some of the parameters, and a lot of that starts with what type of soil you're farming. Whether you're on sand, a silt loam, a clay loam. What's the difference, and why is it important?
Well, sands and clays intrinsically react differently and can only do so much. We have clays that can actually hold so much more water than silts and our sands, but they can hold it so tightly that it won't give it the very last drops to the crop. Whereas a silt will hold a little bit less, but will release more to crops. And then sands just can't hold the water. That's why we have irrigators on top of our sands. And they also don't form structure as strongly as our clays and clay loams. And you won't see as high of organic matter contents on our sands. And so you just can't expect to build a sand to look like a clay.
Now, when you're talking about organic matter, you're comparing and contrasting, and sometimes it's just 2% organic matter versus 4%. And I want you've got a great slide here on the impact and the difference of moisture availability and what it can mean for a corn crop.
That organic matter can hold on to water, and it also helps form structure so that when it rains, the water can get into the soil. When you have less organic matter, you have and more tillage, you have more fine particles on the top, the rain can infiltrate, and you get more of this crusting. So our organic matter is extremely valuable in water management. And so when you have 2% versus 4%, what does that mean for you? Well, it means that your crop can go longer without moisture between the rainfalls, which is really important in July and August in the Northern Hemisphere anyway. So we have, if you can go from, 4 days to 8 days, that can mean the world of difference. There's some with the lower organic matters on sands need rain like almost every day to grow a corn crop when the corn crop is at its most mature.
When you talk about organic matter, you also talk about nutrient value, and you also talk about organic matter moving off the farm. Can you put a value of what is 1% of organic matter valued at from a nutrient perspective, that's blowing or running off the farm?
Oh, it's so sad when it's blowing off the farm. Organic matter 1% generally. Now, maybe your listeners don't understand that organic matter is made from the things that die on top of it. So if you're in a tall grass prairie and you have that being made into organic matter versus under a forest or, in your lawn, you're going to have kind of a different composition to your organic matter. So the numbers I'm giving you are a general range. They're not, exact. You'd have to do your own testing for that. But you have about 1% organic matter, you have about 1,000 pounds of nitrogen. And that's slowly released over the years. And that's what we want. You don't want 1,000 pounds all at once. And it's also based on like how happy your microbes are. So if you have good moisture and good temperatures, you'll get more mineralization of that nitrogen out to the crop. And those are the years that you put down enough nitrogen, say for 200 bushel corn crop, and you got 225. Well, where'd that come from? Your organic matter. Also, your organic matter has a lot of phosphorus and sulfur and some potassium in there. But the thing that it's most well known for is, should be well known for, I think we're starting to understand that more, is carbon. Carbon is invaluable. And about 55% of our organic matter is carbon. So when you lose to wind and water, especially wind, it's taking the topsoil away, which is your most nutrient-rich, organic matter-rich, that dark black soil that we have here in Minnesota and the Midwest, and that's blowing away into the ditch or thousands of miles away.
The dreaded snert. Snow and dirt in the ditches. All right. So big thank you to Jim for that. That does definitely set us up for many of these discussions. And Jason has a great question, so I'm going to go there. I have some of my own, of course. But Jason's question is resilience. If resilience is the ability to bounce back from stress, but bounce back to what? What are we starting with? Or is there a goal to get back to? Now, Jason's out of Manitoba, so Marla, I'll go to you first.
No, great. Thanks, Jason.
Yeah, again.
And Lyndsey. But, okay, this is a great question. I saw that one come up too, and I thought, okay, this is such a fantastic question to ask. So well done, Jason. This is one of the things when I say, when we talk about measuring soil health and what makes it healthy, the question also is, what are you or we trying to gain from that soil in terms of its productivity level, whatever it is that we're trying to kind of get out of that soil. When we're dealing with agricultural soils, we're actually kind of dictating what that level should be or what that kind of perfect soil is. Now, we can dictate what we want to it. We can't change it always to what that is because nature is going to affect that and tell us where its limits are. But within the limitations or within that soil type, there are things that we can kind of assume that we can achieve, but we also have to remember that we're never going to, if we're managing that soil in an agricultural setting, we're never going to get it back to where it started from. We're not going back to 17% organic matter in the Red River Valley unless we want to flood it and leave it to be a swamp again, right? So we're trying to achieve something, whatever it is, within that soil's capability and within kind of our management structure and what we're willing to kind of set as that goal within that management structure.
Mm-hmm. And the Red River Valley does like to flood. It tends to move on. Not this year, of course. Okay, but Anne, over to you. How would you tackle this question?
Very similar, except I'd also bring in the part about what did it start out as and how good is it in the first place? Mm-hmm. Because, and this is part of what Eastern Canada is a little different because many of our soils started out as woodlands, or at least the last 200 years when they were broken, it was the deep dark woods. So you've got soils that were almost pit and mound already. So when you start going and breaking them with tillage, we've got very uneven depth of topsoil. We've got some real variety of different soil types, often within a field where you can go, especially in the area that I work in, you can go from sand at the back to clay at the front. It depends on what you're starting from too. So what can it bounce back from a stress? Yeah, how elastic can it be, but how good was it in the first place? Because there is an element of soil health, and this is where I get in an argument with some soils people. To me, there's soil health, which is our management, and then there's soil quality, what we actually started with. And I usually use my husband as an example. He is an overweight truck driver with a Dutch background. So he really likes his sweets, and he's a diabetic. So we manage that. We manage his health with medication, right? So similarly, we're trying to manage soil health with applied materials, whether it's organic amendments or reducing tillage or bringing in cover crops and rotation. It's the same kind of thing. Whereas the quality is the fact that he is got this genetic background of, he's probably going to head for hypertension and diabetes.
Well, the Dutch do like to put chocolate sprinkles on their toast. So
yes,
I'm just saying.
They do.
That's yes.
Hagasla.
Yeah, exactly. And okay, so Marla.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to add it too, and maybe getting away from the chocolate sprinkles, which now has my mind totally off track. But now I'm hungry. And Jason's jumping into these kind of things too. I see coming in on the chat. But what Jody was talking about, like right away, hits a huge thing at the very beginning when she starts talking about sand versus clay. And I have sat in and listened to people try to sell their soil health tests and all this kind of stuff. And I once listened to somebody make a comment about how they look at all the aspects of soil. They're different than every other lab because they take in and they look at chemical, biological, and physical factors all in the same thing. And they don't discount biology and just focus on the traditional soil tests. And when a farmer in the room asked, okay, but like, do you tell me what my soil type is, my texture? And the guy says, oh no, that's irrelevant. And I'm sitting in the back, Anne's like, those are fighting words, right? And I was sitting in the back of the room and just observing and trying to keep my cool because I was thinking, no, you can't take the genetic base, essentially, like the DNA of that soil, the base that you have to work with, and then discount that because that's the home for the microbes and that's the home for the earthworms and the stuff. So I was just so floored that all of a sudden, and I know that biology is so important, we talk about it so much, but you can't discount all of the other factors just to favor the biology. So
absolutely.
Anyway,
I like that.
No,
I love it. And I have a question for you, Anne, here, Lara, and this I'm from out west as well. So Lara wants to know, do you liken pit and mound to a prairie pothole? What does pit and mound mean in this context? I don't think it's like a prairie pothole.
It's not the same thing. No. So you got to think about a forest, and as the trees mature and die and fall over, the roots go up. Sorry, I talk with my hands. And you have this hole that's left behind. Yeah. And so you end up with this undulating topography on a kind of a micro scale almost. And now as they reforest areas in this part of the province, they will actually recreate that pit and mound because those pits actually hold water at crucial times of the year. Yes. Whereas the mounds give a dry area for different things to grow. It's all the ecology. Yeah, it's kind of cool.
Well, it is. So, and I will say, on our farm here, we're just west of Ottawa. And when these trees come over, it is remarkable to me, the giant space that they leave as an impression, right? Or a depression, I suppose. So yeah, really quite fantastic. I had no idea it had a name. So there we go. We're all learning, everyone. All of us are learning. Okay. So yes, quality. Definitely. So we're talking about health. We're talking about quality. I love, Marla, that you use the DNA of the soil. So that's our soil type. And that is going to, of course, to me, it's a great example, Anne, that does sort of give you a base of certain things this soil is going to do or not do. And you can't ever change those, right?
No, I mean, that dictate the limitations of that soil.
Yes, absolutely. And also, Anne, your reference to sand at the back and clay at the front is apparently a soil mullet. So business at the back or party at the back and business in the front. So there you go. Thanks, Jason, for that. There we go. It's our soil mullet. Okay. So, but I do want to hit on a few of the things, and we've talked a bit about them as well, of course, so how do we manage our soils to build that resiliency? So Anne, I'll start with you.
Sure. So to me, there's always the main four things, which the first one right off the bat is crop rotation. And, corn, soybean back and forth is not a rotation.
That's right.
If we want a rotation, it needs to involve something else, small grains, whether it's winter wheat. I know they've all heard from Wheat Pete over the years and Dave Hooker. We know that wheat builds resiliency. There's some recent papers out by Bill Dean and others showing that that is really critical under drought or dry conditions, is to have that diversification and complicate a little more complicated crop rotations. Cover crops can add to that. The reducing tillage is also important, and the one place where we can always build some organic matter and feed those microbes that we talk about is bringing in organic amendments. So there's a variety of different organic amendments that are available within our province, between, green waste to manures and other things like that. So those are, to me, the main pieces that we can do to build a bit more resilience. Of course, and I'm sure Marla will get into this too, is around managing compaction or controlling compaction, because we can build structure, but we can also destroy structure. So there's the things to add and there's the things to manage.
Mm-hmm. We actually have a clip that talks a little bit about compaction that we may actually get to. But before I do that, Marla, I do want to get sort of your part of this, because, one of the interesting things about where you farm has a significant impact on how, obviously, all those factors that Anne mentions have an impact. But one of the things certainly that we're seeing, or the conversations we have out west, and of course right now is, yes, very dry, but you've got a shortened season. We can obviously diversify rotation, and a lot of farmers do. There's a lot of great crop options out west. But what are some of the things that, with more of a western slant, that are perhaps the most popular of trying to build our soils?
Well, I mean, decreasing tillage has always been a thing. When you think of the West, we think of zero till, but you have to go farther west than Manitoba for that sometimes, because obviously we're quite diverse in terms of our soil types that we're dealing with, and our climates in general, and soil kind of textures and situations here in Manitoba. But like decreasing tillage, that being said, I mean, I worked for the Manitoba Zero Till Research Farm. I am a zero till proponent. I don't want to say that I'm a fanatic, because I think that we need to also think about flexibility in our management systems. And when we deal with growers, say in the Red River Valley, so when we're dealing with some dry years, sometimes the guys don't want to till. I had a chat with a couple, 2 years ago, I guess. It was dry in the fall, and I was chatting with a local farmer, and he called me up and he said, "You know what, Marla, it was dry last year, we didn't till. But this year we got the crop off, and I'm trying to decide whether or not I should till." And I said, "Well, what's making you want to till this year?" He says, "Well, we have time." And I thought, okay, but this is exactly the thing that happens. We've got time. What are we going to do? I'm like, how about you go fishing? That sounds like a good use of your time right now, because you don't necessarily have to till just because you have the time to till, but it's hard to break some of those habits. But the problem with the Red River Valley is that you also don't know when you're going to deal with wet. So it's such a troublesome and trickier soil to manage. Whereas the farther west you go, we see these decreases and movements into no-till, really to conserve moisture, keep that soil covered, decrease a lot of that potential erosion. And I think that that's an absolutely fantastic thing if it's working for you. It's a great activity, or lack of activity in this case, to actually do on the soil. But we do need to recognize that the occasional bit of tillage isn't necessarily going to mess everything up when it's needed.
Right. I know that people get offended when we talk about recreational tillage, because and we say, like, I'm sure I speak for many when I say it's of course it's with tongue in cheek, but I know, for where I live around here, I've heard more than one farmer tell me that, they still do certain tillage passes to keep dad busy, right? He wants a job, he needs something to do, it's safe, it's a way that he can contribute, and those sorts of things. And I also recognize that, the equipment that you have, you can't just flip all your equipment in a year, right? That's not necessarily feasible either. So change takes time as well, and adopting some of these practices or not practices, I suppose. Okay, I want to go again, journey to the second clip. I love, and this clip is from 4 years ago. And this is going to set us up to talk about water infiltration and talk about all those wonderful soil microbes. And so I want to give a shout out here. We've got Peter Johnson and Adam Hayes, but I in the video also are Chris and Kelly Armstrong from Renfrew County, who are holding the clothesline of a whole bunch of soiled undies. So Jay, if we could go to that clip.
Putting your underwear in the soil, what's that all about, Adam?
Yes, Innovative Farmers did soil undies, so we thought we would do it in Renfrew County as part of a soil health project there. So we buried underwear the end of May and dug it up again in early August. So about 2 months, the underwear were buried in the soil.
Okay, so and what happens in the soil to the underwear? What's going on?
Okay, so we bury it just in that top 6 to 8 inches of the soil, and so that's the most biologically active area. So all the bacteria, fungi, earthworms, all that soil life is there to feed on that cotton.
Okay, so the less underwear is left, the healthier soil we've got.
Exactly.
Okay, so talk a little bit about what we're seeing here and whether you'd call this, as we walk along, is this good, bad, indifferent? What would you expect to see?
Okay, so these first few that we have here are very good. There's very little left. They fed and eaten up most of the cotton that was there. The waistband is above the surface, so it's not usually touched. This one here was...
Yeah, this is terrible.
Yeah.
This is terrible. What's this?
Would be terrible, but it was a field that was in winter wheat, had an excellent winter wheat crop, and no rain after that. So there was the biology just sat dormant and did very little feeding. Okay,
so it's we have a couple things going on, right? So one is how healthy your soil, but we need some other parameters like temperature and moisture are also coming into play. Is right. what I hear you saying.
Yeah,
okay,
exactly.
So carry on.
This one again, similar situation, only it was in a pasture field. So there was, again, you'd think a very healthy situation, but again, a very dry period. There wasn't a lot of moisture there to feed the biology on that as well.
So, okay, yep. And down at the end here, we've got some that are almost shook.
Yeah, so this one, very good. This one is just awesome. There's nothing left of it. And then this one is, not quite as good, but it's still fairly good because there's been a fair bit of feeding, but not quite as healthy a situation there.
Yeah, so really cool. So Adam, in terms of a farmer wants to do this themselves, moisture is one thing that plays, which is a little bit worrisome. The other thing that I'd like to ask, what about, so I've got a fence row, and I've got my field, which should be in winter wheat, by the way, but would it be a good indication of how the field was if I buried some in the fence row and also in the field and then looked at that comparatively?
Yeah, that would be a good comparison. We often like to use the fence row as sort of here's what your field could be, and then here's where you're at. So that would be a good comparison.
Awesome, really cool stuff. So thanks very much, Adam.
I really do love when we make Wheat Pete do interviews. Thanks for being a good sport. Okay, and I also want to point out that Dave Shovey, our producer here tonight, said that those ones that were hardly eaten at all, he says those have plenty of life left in them. So anyway, typical Jay. Okay, so I love this project. I know that this has been done now. So that was 4 years ago. I know that there's been several. There's even 4-H clubs that do this Soil Your Undies project, all those sorts of things. So really fantastic. But this brings in this placonversation of microbes, of the flora and fauna and all our friends that live down in the soil and what they're all doing. And so and I'll go to you. We do also have at one point a terrifying photo, but a fascinating thing. But explain to me, because Lara's also asked a really good question about this, but explain to me just how important it is that we start to understand the diversity of what's happening in the soil.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure that we have to understand all the diversity because there's a thing called functional redundancy. We've got so many different microbes in the soil, and they will express themselves when the conditions are right. And by functional redundancy, I mean that they'll do similar jobs. So we do have some resilience just in the soil biology by itself. But the biggest thing is we have to support it. So we have to feed them. We have to create a habitat. So that means, again, still, sorry, coming back to avoiding compaction, because we need pore space. Many of these live either in the rhizosphere, so along the roots, or in actual pore space and in the water films within pore space. A lot of it is, again, we're going to get that diversity and support the microbes with good rotations. And the key part, the reason why we get so excited about microbes is the more recent understanding of how organic matter is laid down, how carbon is stabilized in the soil. It basically has to go through a microbe. When I graduated many eons ago, when the dinosaurs still walked the earth, our understanding was much more rudimentary. And, I thought, oh yeah, grow a huge cover crop, knock it down, work it in, boom, we got organic matter. Well, that is not the understanding. That's not the way it works. We know that we need living roots. We need the root exudates. All those complex sugars and carbohydrates feed the microbes. And by doing that, especially for us at least, in Eastern Canada, having those living roots are a bigger deal for building organic matter actually than probably reducing tillage, just because of our temperate. We're just too wet most of the time. So if we want to cycle more organic matter, it means more living roots longer.
And this is one of the things, and for sure, that in these conversations of trying to build organic matter, one of the challenges for Ontario farmers very much is the fact that it's warmer and wetter, and that drives these cycles, right? So you've got to be feeding those cycles, or else the microbes burn through this organic matter.
Especially if you're on a sandy soil. Sands are just a constant work in progress that you just have to keep feeding them, and you really have to concentrate on maintaining organic matter, because we've got sands in southwestern Ontario that are down to less than 1% organic matter, which means that's very little water holding capacity. It's not a lot of anything to help hold nutrients, all those things. So sands are the tough one. But, just as Jody talked in that first clip, I think it was around whether the clays or the sands both benefit from having more organic matter. So it still comes back to the biology. We've got to have microbes, and we have to feed those microbes.
Now, Marla, and we may get to the clip about compaction, maybe not, but of course, in Manitoba, maybe we might. Well, I feel bad running it because it was after a wet fall, and it's just so dry in the West that I feel like I'll offend people. That's why. But so compared to, say, here in Ontario, I mean, you've got very heavy clay soils in the Red River Valley, shorter season, but lots of moisture. So what does the soil Urundi's comparison look like in, say, Manitoba?
Well, I have to say, first of all, that I was really happy to see Adam showing underwear that was buried in that winter wheat field and in a pasture field that did not break down, because I have done the exact same thing. And there's a clip or a photo that Don Flayton shows of me all the time, standing up there with the underwear that we did at Crop Diagnostic School a few years ago. And I've got this one pair that's completely broken down. There's nothing left except for the seams, essentially, compared to another that didn't break down much at all. And the one that broke down fully was in a well-tilled, well-fertilized cornfield. And the other one was, 6 feet away in the plot next to it. That was an alfalfa field. And it was drier the time of year. There's just not moisture. So it doesn't mean, again, that the one that didn't break down wasn't active or wasn't healthy. It just wasn't as active in the moment because it didn't have the conditions that would have that kind of quick breakdown of organic matter. So I've seen the same thing. I'm often jealous when I look on Twitter and I see somebody and they've got this perfect comparison. And I was like, how did they do that? Because that never works for me. And then I start thinking that you can't always read or believe everything that you see online. And then I wonder about everybody's posts on Twitter and whether they're really being as truthful, because it doesn't work for me when I do it. But it's really because it's more complicated. Unfortunately, it's a lot more complicated, but it's a great visual and it's a great thing to get people talking and learning. So I love it. but it doesn't always work the same way. And you've got a comment about that.
It doesn't always work here in Ontario. And it usually, there's growers I've worked with where they've buried it, and they buried it, of course, snuck across the fence row to the neighbors and casually buried underwear in the neighbor's field that's heavily tilled, and then been just heartbroken to find that their underwear is still wearable and the neighbors is nothing. And it usually does come back to it usually does come back to moisture and nitrogen availability.
Absolutely. So then when we talk about, like we have no problems hanging on to organic matter around here. And we have no problems hanging on to organic matter further west too, in that if we decrease tillage and such, like we don't burn through things so fast because we're drier. We got some heat, we got a shorter season though, and we're drier in general than you are in Ontario. And so it's a totally different thing, which is also a great reason why we need to remember that when we talk about, research in mineralization rates of nitrogen or things like that, we need to use data and information that comes from the area that we are from and that matches that region, that everything that's happening in terms of end mineralization, say from cover crops in Ontario, is not going to be relative for us in Manitoba or even in Alberta.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
Now, Jay, if you can bring up the photo of to help visualize what is happening below ground, Anne shared this image, and I will now have nightmares. So, Anne, it looks like a very sick jellyfish, and possibly one that's trying to kill me. So, walk us through, what are we looking at here?
Okay, so this is a latex mold of earthworm channels. And I know Marla and I were talking earlier that, again, here we've got the east-west divide in terms of whether we've got earthworms as a sign of soil health or not. But in eastern Canada, we do. Again, woodland soils. Most of the earthworms are imported. They came with the immigrants. And so this is a latex mold. It's actually, I can give you the history of the field because it's actually one of mine. It had winter wheat. And after the winter wheat was off, I scraped away an area and I poured liquid latex. And it goes down all the earthworm channels. And if you give it about 3 weeks or a month, it sets up. And we get this lovely jellyfish type of mold. The cool thing about this, though, is when you look at the history and how quickly things can come back. And I love it. I know it's creepy as all get out, but I love it because it's visual. You can see it. The cool part about that is these are the dew worms. So these are the worms you'd go fishing with, even in the West, the ones you buy in a cup and you don't release in the forest. These are the ones, they've got a vertical burrow. They're really important for giving us some better internal drainage. Unfortunately, after some of the heavy rains, we've got a lot of dead ones, but they're the ones that you can just watch water drain away so well. So anyways, the background history on this, it was wheat. Prior to the wheat, it had been soybeans. The wheat was no-till. The soybeans were minimum till. Corn before that, the corn had been plowed, and prior to that was 4 years or 5 years of hay with manure, and the hay had been plowed. Yes, I have to admit the plow came to our house.
It's okay.
There's a program for that.
Yeah, that's right.
Safe space here, and it's okay.
Yeah. But what I got out of this, and I've been digging earthworms for close to 30 years and counting them, and I had never really got how connected everything was. So what you see hanging down, like I said, is the dew worms, the Lumbriscus terrestris, but then all that frilly stuff at the top, that's all the other worms that live in that top 4 to 6 inches and do a lot of the nutrient cycling. And this poor mold has traveled a lot. A lot of children have hung on it. And when you realize that those long strips are a good 3 feet, some of them, and I still broke them. And actually, I lie. It wasn't me. It was my students. They spent a whole day excavating this in the heat in July one year. Those long ones can go down 6 feet, especially this time of year when it's hot. So it just makes the point, especially in our Eastern Canada soils, that these are really important for internal drainage. And if we do tillage, we cut right through them.
Mm-hmm.
They can regenerate really quickly, but only if we reduce the amount of tillage, because the thing is with those dew worms, they really don't lay that many eggs. It's not like they're having dozens and dozens of baby earthworms. They're having like 5 or 6. So it does take time to spread them and to get them out there. So yeah, I still think it's really cool.
It is really cool, but also somewhat terrifying. Now, but Marla, this is on Anne's farm.
Yeah.
If we were to do something similar in Manitoba, which please do, it would not look like this. How do you think it would look different?
You want me to do it in Manitoba so it won't look like this because it freaks you out too much. So you want to see the piddly little things that we would end up seeing out of Manitoba. We don't have these worms in Manitoba. And so I'm jealous when I see this. I think this is fascinating, Lyndsey. And I'm jealous when I see this because it's an amazing thing. Now, our soil's totally different, right? We get in the Red River Valley anyway, and other areas that have, cracking, swelling clays. When things dry out, we also have cracks down to 6 feet. But they're a crack in the soil from dry soils. It's not made by an earthworm. And so we don't have these like the dew worms and these kind of larger worms that are really making those deep pore spaces. We're relying on our crops, we're relying on tap roots, we're relying on all of that kind of thing to create that. But the same idea still stands. You till those channels when you have those pores, whether they're made by the earthworm, you till up, you plow through that, you chop that off, you fluff everything up above it, and you've lost the connectivity of that pore to the surface. And so that still is the same no matter where you are.
Yes, absolutely. And it's not to say that there aren't earthworms in Manitoba, of course.
No,
there aren't these gigantic ones that go down 6 feet and potentially give me nightmares. Okay, no, that's fine. I actually quite like worms. It's okay. Sort of. All right. Where this does actually, I am going to play the clip. And so I am going to apologize to everyone from Western Canada or anywhere in the US that is dealing with excessively dry conditions and drought. I do wonder, this is how, though, I want to bring up the compaction discussion. So we'll run this quick clip. This is at a NDSU. This is Aaron Degg, and I believe it's Kara is doing the interview, talking about compaction, the impact of compaction, how we fix ruts. So we'll go to the clip, and then I want to talk about infiltration and all those sorts of fun things.
So, soil compaction has been a big topic this last winter. Here in the region where I'm at, we had a very wet 2019 year. It started wet in the spring, which delayed planting, which put the risk on the back end now for harvest. And sure enough, we had some pretty substantially wet conditions during harvest. A lot of acres actually ended up overwintering and are still being harvested right now. And so fields that were able to get harvested in the fall, if it was done early enough with some of the smaller grains, then perhaps there was little risk of soil compaction during the harvest. However, for corn and soybean and other grains that were harvested late in the year, they was not ideal conditions. Many fields, quite prevalent throughout the region, had combine and way wagon tracks up and down the entire length of the field, every single pass. And one of the things that we know through research and just not in this region, but anywhere region in the world pretty much, is that if you have ruts that form, then you have deep soil compaction. And that is going to have some form of a yield consequence, not only for next year's crop, but also for the year after that. Most soil compaction issues, it's a multi-year recovery. So typically, no matter what the crop is, whether it's a small grain, large grain, if you have deep soil compaction from wheel traffic, you can anticipate probably anywhere from, on average, a 15 to 20% yield loss for that next 1 and 2 years that's going to follow up afterwards.
So long term, how long can these impacts stick around if producers aren't actually doing anything about compaction?
So once the compaction initially happens, it's going to take a couple years to recover, almost no matter what you do. Because usually when you have ruts, the compaction extends down below what your tillage implements, typical tillage implements are going to be. And even if you have something like a deep ripper that can reach down 16 to 24 inches or so, it's still highly unreliable with it actually getting the outcome that you want for bringing yields back up. It's just not a reliable tool for deep compaction like that. So the first 2 years, almost anything you do, you know that you'll have a loss. So that's something that's, unfortunate. We just don't have a useful tool at our disposal to deal with it, but it's something to keep in mind for when you're going out on wet soils. The best way to prevent losses is to prevent the compaction occurring in the first place, other than relying on something to try to remediate that compaction.
Marla, I apologize that he brought up deep ripping, because I know that you find it personally offensive. I'm just kidding. Sort of. In that, I'm not entirely kidding. Okay, so and again, I mean, it is wild to think that video was talking about the fall of 2019 and then dealing with spring ruts, and it's wild to think of where we're at now. It wasn't that long ago. But let's talk about compaction then. So, Anne, you've hit on it a little bit, but Marla, you've done a lot of work on this as well. Why is compaction so difficult on our soils?
Well, okay, first of all, can I say that I'm okay that we're talking about it right now while it's dry? And that's because we see a lot of the impacts of that compaction in yields showing up in our dry years because, and our wet years, it depends. When we're hitting these kinds of extremes, when it's really wet and you've got water ponding and not moving through the soil because it's compacted, when it's really dry, if you are in some conditions, sometimes a little compaction can help because it helps hold water a bit when you do get it. But a lot of times it's actually impacting crop movement and root movement even more when it's dry and compacted. So we're going to see the impacts of this through the wet years and the dry years. And we only ever talk about it in the wet years because those are the years that we're really kind of causing the compaction. But I often say that we need to be talking about it right now, too, because as we're prepping for potentially what's looking to be a dry fall and a drier harvest season, I don't know if I want to say the right thing. Like, harvest is a stressful time of year, so you don't necessarily want to be practicing proper field management at harvest. But at the same time, when it's wet, we have too much else on the go to worry about whether or not we're planning for how to travel across the field. But when it's dry, we've got a bit more resiliency in the soil. So maybe this is the time when you want to think about how you're traveling across the field, whether we're impacting the soil the same or not. So, in those busy seasons or seasons leading up to a wet fall or in a dry fall, we can be talking about these things with the grain cart operator. In the clip, when the grain cart was out there, traveling along with the combine, what happens after it's full? So when the grain cart is full, does it just rip off and go willy-nilly across the field until it hits the approach and drives off? Or does it move back onto where the combine tracks were and go to the headlands and then turn and follow the headlands back to the field? It's those little tiny tweaks that make a huge difference when we're in moist or wet conditions. Don't really matter so much when it's dry, but those are the times to kind of put those habits in place in a way and think about how we're trafficking the field.
Really good point for sure. In that correct me if I'm wrong, but it's my understanding that most of the compaction happens in that first pass, that first drive over, right? So if you want to minimize total compaction, using the same wheel tracks would decrease your overall compaction of that field.
Yeah, we say 80% happens in the first pass. And where that number comes from is if you would travel across the field 4 times in the exact same tracks and counted that total compaction as 100%, 80% of it happened the first time you traveled across. And the additional 20% came from the pass 2, 3, 4. So it's a huge potential impact. Again, if it's dry right now, we don't have the actual impact on the soil because the soil is resilient in its dryness in this case when it comes to compaction. But that being said, in these drier years is when we can actually see some of that long-term impact from that compaction in the wetter years show up and start impacting the crop even further.
Mm-hmm. Now, and Anne, you of course talked about the role that airspace and so root spaces, the water film. So we need airspace, we need aggregate stability, but we need those pores in the soil to actually, that helps our microbes, right? So Jay, can you bring up the water infiltration clip that Anne sent, not the tweet, the one with the 4 different pails. Can you bring that one up? Because Anne, I want to talk about this in a bit. But so explain though then, so how compaction changes how our microbes can function.
Okay, well, we're still expecting the microbes to function along the root surfaces and through pore space. And with compaction, actually, there's another picture I should have sent you. Darn
it.
Anyways, yeah, so you may have seen it anyways. There's a number of us that have the same picture. And it basically shows a soil in the pore space before compaction and after compaction. And I usually put it up in front of people and say, what's the difference? And the striking difference usually right off the bat is that there's less pore space. And I usually go, yeah, you're right, but there's something else going on here. And it's not just less pore space and that there's smaller pores, which means the water's held more tightly. But usually when we get compaction, there's less connectivity, less connectedness between pores. Mm-hmm. And that's really important for internal movement of water. So what this is, I don't know if the video will run on this or not, these are my 4 pet soils. One is a bush lot, one is a hayfield, and one is continuous corn, and the other one is a more rotated crop. But when it does run, the thing you notice right off the bat is the bush lot and the hayfield. There's bubbles coming up. These are disc infiltrometers. They're very small. There's just a little bit of a almost like a cloth type material at the bottom, and then you put the top in and it's suction. So it's got to go out through the bottom. There's just a tiny little air hole that allows air to come in. And what you would see is that one at the front on the left-hand side is just bubbling away to beat the band because it's just flowing. We use this demonstration. It's nice and portable. We used it at one of our outdoor diagnostic days, and that particular one at the point when I finally got the video taken had been running all day. And the thing is, with stable aggregates, strong, stable aggregates, not only are they resistant to erosion and compaction, but under extended wet conditions like what we've been seeing here in Ontario, they stay strong and they keep that pore space and the water still moves, which means our tiles still work. So as long as we've got outlet, and with some of the big rainstorms, we haven't had a lot of outlet. But, if you get a 2-inch rain, you probably have some outlet and you can get the water off the field, because that's usually the one that hurts us the most here in Ontario is too much water.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, unfortunately. Certainly there have been dry seasons or dry areas, but really it's too much water and the need to move that water through the soil profile and off the field so you can, A, get on the field when you need to, and B, of course, have crops that can continue to grow. Not many of them have snorkels, I've learned. Now, Gord says he's surprised and encouraged by how quickly deep worm channels are rebuilt after tillage. But as you mentioned, and these worms aren't ones that repopulate very quickly.
Yeah, and actually, I'm glad you brought that up, what Gord put up there, because I wanted to make the point. Yeah, they're rebuilt after tillage, but remember, I gave you the whole history on that piece. So it had a couple of years of tillage, it had a diverse rotation, but it was also coming out a long period of being in hay with manure applied. Mm-hmm. So we've fed them. I will freely admit there's probably some compaction in that hayfield, because that happens in hayfields, and especially this year in Ontario.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, between hay and wheat fields trying to get straw off right now, There is definitely compaction going on, and that is kind of sad. I don't expect that usually in wheat fields.
So my question then is, I mean, we've talked about resiliency in the sense of water holding capacity, nutrient cycling, water infiltration. But when it comes to compaction, is there really any way to help our soils deal with it, or is it really just about avoiding that really tough first drive over when it's wet?
Do you want to go, Marla?
Well, I'm curious what you have to say, Anne. You had your brain was working, so go for it.
Well, I think there is there's a number of different ways to approach compaction. One is still, I'm still going to keep beating the band around crop rotation, because by having those diverse root systems in there, when we build stronger aggregates, they do actually withstand low levels of compaction. Then we also still have to manage it. And so that means with time, it doesn't all happen in 1 year, and I get that, because tires are expensive. But we can make changes to tires. We can make changes to inflation systems. There's some really great information out there. If you check out the Innovative Farmers Association of Ontario, they've had their compaction action days, and a lot of that material is posted online. It's great stuff, and it gives you some really good ideas about how to reduce the compactive potential. And I think you also have to look beyond. We usually associate harvest equipment with compaction and manure application, but I think you also need to take a look at your sprayer, and we need to look at our air seeders, because there can be some pretty big weights on some of those air seeders too. So you have to look at the whole system, even in horticulture, because I'm the weird one here, being the hort person. But when we start looking at systems that we have in growing apples, high density apples are working with a lot more traffic, mechanical harvest of grapes, and processing crops. So we've had processing vegetables in this area for a long time. A lot of that can cause some fairly severe compaction too. But the way to fix it usually is good rotation, growing some deep-rooted crops, coming back if you can get hay in the rotation, or if you can't because that's not your rotation, then looking at some deeper-rooted cover crops, and on occasion having to sacrifice an area and planting it and not actually cropping it for a bit.
Yeah. No, and that's avoidance is great when we can do avoidance as much as possible, and decreasing traffic, or thinking about how we traffic, thinking about, like you said, tire inflation, all of that kind of thing that we can manage to the best of our ability. We still can't take it away completely. If we're going to travel over a field, we're going to potentially cause some level of compaction. But crop rotation, when you mention crop rotation, what that really does for me is a couple things. You've got roots exploring different areas of the soil with the different crops that are growing over those many years within that rotation, which is beneficial because that exploration helps to break up some of those, compacted areas potentially. But the other benefit to having a nice diverse crop rotation is that it actually gives you an additional opportunity to change your practices across the field, like how you manage the field from year to year. So when I talk about things like rotational tillage, the idea of kind of decreasing, maybe not having to go to full zero till, but decreasing tillage where you can in your crop rotation based on the residue you're dealing with, the crop that you're planning to put in next year, and what you need for a seed bed going in that next year. You have, with that diversity in your rotation, more opportunity for that diversity in your tillage management as well. And by doing that, we can also decrease how and where we're impacting the soil. On top of just the general kind of concept of, how often we spray it, what kind of practices, what we're going across, what harvest looks like, all of that kind of thing. But there's so many opportunities when we have those diverse systems to be able to make little subtle changes to our management, which can be really beneficial in the long run.
Well, and the other thing too, if you've got something, at least for us, if we've got something that can grow through the winter, so traditionally we would have dry soils this time of year, and then we'd get wetter, especially once the tomato harvesters come out. But if we can get winter wheat or winter canola into the rotation, then we've got a time when the soils are normally quite moist. So even if they are compacted, the root has a greater chance of being able to get past that compaction layer and start to make some macropores that will aid in breaking that up over time. Yes. So that diversity of crop really, it's so many different pieces that it brings to it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, I love it. All right, Jason has one last question, and then just like that, we are out of time, which is ridiculous. So Jason says he had a grower that did deep ripping a number of acres in fall of 2020. So Marla, just take a breath. It's okay. And those areas are actually hurt more this spring because, of course, the dry fall followed by a dry spring, the water moved down through those areas and was, boom, gone. So what would have been perhaps, now we can't see the future, we don't know what is ahead of us as far as a dry year or an extremely dry year, but for a farmer that is potentially thinking about deep ripping to deal with some compaction, what might be a better option?
Oh man, this is a hard one because people who want to deep rip are going to deep rip whether they tell them to not to or not. Like it's something that they want to do. It's this thing they got to go out and do. So, but in a case like this, I've seen this go both ways. And this is one of the things that I talk about with growers when they're thinking about deep ripping is that I can see it go positive and negative. There are some years where you get, like if we had a really wet year following that, it may have been beneficial. The problem is we never know exactly what we're going to get. And deep ripping when it's dry is more effective for actually getting not to have a slot and actually having the soil break up a little bit. So when you've got the dry conditions, that is a potential time to do it. And when I have there's one time I actually suggested someone deep rip and we did a study in their field and it looked pretty good. And that's because it was a sandy soil. It was a different soil. It doesn't naturally break up the same way as the clay does. And so we actually saw some benefit to that kind of fine sandy soil. But there are other options if you're looking at trying to kind of break up a bit of essentially with the surface. And we can get into the whole thing about what tillage implement you want to go in with. But essentially, if the idea was to break up deep, there wasn't anything else that was going to do it in a short term than going in and deep ripping. But the reality is that the situation was the benefit just wasn't there. It would have been better to leave it, but we just don't know exactly what's coming. And so more often than not, the benefit is to leave it and not do the deep ripping. But it's a hard sell.
Yeah. Well, and if you have a deep ripper, you're probably going to use it, just so you know.
Yeah. Or you're going to rent one. Like, sometimes you're going to rent one.
We tend to do that.
Like after you've got it, you're going to use it. Yeah.
We own one. And I will say that where we have used it is after 2017, which, Anne, you might remember was an incredibly wet year. We actually had to do hay. We had to do our first and second cut essentially at the same time because we could not find a window to make hay. We had to blow it all into a bag because we had no time whatsoever. And the compaction from driving across those wet fields was just awful. So we did use it strategically, only on that wheel traffic area and that sort of stuff, not across, of course, the whole field. But I mean,
and when it was dry,
yes,
you
it was like
when it was dry.
Year. Yes,
and you checked the depth of compaction before you did it.
Yeah, you don't want to go as deep as you possibly can. You want to go just where you have to.
That's bad because that to me just seems incredibly destructive and also a really high diesel bill.
Yes,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So there's these farm trials in Iowa that they did where they actually split fields in half and they monitored how much fuel was used to actually do the subsoiling or deep ripping. And they looked at what the yield benefit was with the combine after the fact. So in the years after this ripping had been done. And what they found was you had a 50-50 chance of actually making enough money in extra yield to pay for the cost of subsoiling. And to me, those odds aren't good enough.
And at least our experience is it only lasted 1 year.
And that's the other thing that they said too. Like this was Iowa, same thing. You redo it. And we've seen the same thing in deep ripping studies in Manitoba on those heavy clay soils that Jason's been talking about, where they ripped it and within 2 to 3 years following, the soil was basically back to where it was. So it's not one of those things that you're going to do and it's just going to fix it and it's all, happy and your soil's never compacted. We keep recompacting the soil. So the reality is that as we keep compacting it, we're just going to have to keep ripping it if that's what we choose to do. Or we can think of other ways to manage the soil a bit better.
Okay. And I have to ask, what's the cat's name? Because we're now, a year and a half into doing Zoom meetings. And the rule now is if a pet arrives on screen, they have to be introduced.
Yeah, well, this is Katja. She thinks she's Zoom Cat because if there's a conversation going on at a certain time of the day, she shows up. Now, if you were to walk in my house, you would never know she lives here.
Oh, see? She likes to be on TV.
She doesn't like people. She just likes it this way.
I love it.
I love it. Okay. All right. Now, Jason, this is going to be the last question, but I really like it. And Anne, maybe I'll go to you on this one, even though Jason is out of Manitoba, but because Anne, of course, you have worked with quite a few cover crops. And I do see some of these amazing like cocktails, right? We've got 20, some different species in there, So the question is, what have you seen for building soil resiliency with multiple species cover crops? So it does come down to, are all those, if it's only a cover crop, so it's in there a short time, do you need 20 species or can you do good things with 1 or 2?
It's complicated. It's really complicated.
I'm glad you went to Anne on this one.
Yeah.
It's that depends. Okay, so really, it's great putting the multi-species and it's great having the diversity and the diversity of root exudates and all that. But so far, we haven't been able to piece it out that really makes a huge difference having 20 different species. Because generally only 3 or 4 are actually expressed if you start looking.
Right.
And God knows I've done enough biomass harvest with Adam over the years. What we've seen, and Dr. Laura Vineyard's work supports this, is even 1 or 2 will make a difference in terms of building organic matter. But the critical part for us seems to be in having something that lives over the winter. So having cereal rye on her plots where she's got cereal rye and cereal rye with radish. Those are the ones where we're seeing a gain in organic matter over actually 7 to 9 years on a fairly high organic matter sandy loam. So when we can build it with a little bit of a cover crop, so I don't know that we need to do big ones, but even small mixtures, I think it's more important to pick the species and how long they're there in terms of, that again, coming back to that living root system and what you're trying to achieve with that cover crop is the other thing. So some of those big multi-species mix, if what you're trying to do is graze, that's great. But if you're trying to bale it, maybe not so much. And if you're just trying to keep the ground covered, maybe there's something cheaper. It all depends. It all comes back to goals.
Right. And if you're trying to get people to take pictures for Instagram, then make sure you put sunflowers in it.
And Phacelia and buckwheat.
And
Phacelia for sure. You need the bees.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we've got it sorted. Now we know those farmers that reach for the 20 species, they're doing it for the gram. All right. This is wonderful. Thank you both so much. We are out of time. We're going to get the hard stop here, but Jay's going to he's going to get the cane and he's just going to pull me across and that's it. We're done. All right. So Marla and Anne, thank you so much for joining me tonight. Of course, everyone who is here in the comments and for anyone looking for those CEU credits, make sure you head over to realagriculture.com/agronomist tomorrow. This was a fascinating discussion. I thank you both so much for your time tonight. And, quick note, there will not be an agronomist next week because it is the holiday, but we'll be back the week after that. So thanks everyone for joining us. Good night, everybody.